The dust clung to the dry air as the SEAL team gathered near the ridge, their rifles slung across their backs and their eyes squinting toward the horizon. They had been deployed to this remote mountain range for reconnaissance and security, but the terrain was hostile, the winds fierce, and the enemies they were tracking had vanished into caves beyond a canyon that stretched impossibly wide. To cross it would mean certain exposure, to wait was to risk ambush. Somewhere on the opposite slope, nearly a mile away, a small antenna jutted out from the rocks, the kind used for field communications. Taking that out would blind the insurgents and give the team a tactical advantage, but it was positioned with such precision that even the most trained sniper in the unit had shaken his head after sighting down his scope. The wind sheer across the canyon made the shot nearly impossible. "No one can hit that," Lieutenant Hale muttered, his voice flat with finality as he adjusted his cap against the glaring sun. The men around him nodded. They were hardened professionals, not given to exaggeration, and they knew what impossible looked like. Standing a few paces behind them was someone who did not belong, at least not in their eyes. Her name was Sarah, and she had not come to this war zone as a soldier or contractor. She had arrived months earlier as a volunteer medic, patching up wounded villagers and offering basic first aid where supplies ran thin. She wore no uniform, only a faded olive shirt tucked into loose pants and a scarf around her hair to keep out the dust. Her presence with the team that morning had been more of a coincidence than intention. She had accompanied them to help treat anyone injured during the patrol. When the conversation about the impossible shot rose and fell like the dry wind, she remained quiet, her eyes fixed on the glinting antenna far away across the canyon. She had grown up in the plains back home, in a forgotten farming town where her father had taught her to shoot cans off fence posts to pass the time. It had been a game, a way to keep a restless girl entertained, but the lessons of breathing, patience, and reading the wind had been drilled into her bones as surely as the rhythm of harvests and seasons. She had never thought of it as special, just something she did because her father insisted she should never miss what she aimed at. Now, listening to the SEAL officer dismiss the shot as impossible, something stirred in her chest, a mixture of defiance and certainty. She stepped forward, her boots crunching against the gravel, drawing a few surprised glances from the men. "I can hit it," she said, her voice calm, not boastful. For a moment silence hung heavy, broken only by the whine of the wind scraping through the canyon. Lieutenant Hale turned his head toward her, one brow raised, his lips curling into the kind of half-smile that held no warmth. "You," he scoffed. "This isn't a carnival game, lady. That's nearly a mile across unstable air. My best man can't guarantee that shot. You don't just pick up a rifle and try because you've seen it in movies." A few of the soldiers chuckled under their breath, though one or two shifted uncomfortably, sensing that she had spoken with too much conviction to be brushed off as a joke. Sarah didn't flinch under the officer's stare. She simply extended her hand, palm up, in quiet request. "Let me try," she said. "If I miss, nothing changes. If I hit, you get the advantage you need." There was an unspoken tension then, the kind that arises when pride and possibility collide. Hale wanted to shut her down outright. Civilians had no place handling his team's weapons, let alone attempting a shot his snipers considered unfeasible. But he also felt the eyes of his men on him, the dry weight of their curiosity, their hunger for a sliver of hope in a situation that seemed stalled. Finally, with a shake of his head, he motioned to Corporal Diaz, who reluctantly unslung his long-range rifle and placed it carefully on the rocky ground. "Fine," Hale muttered. "You want to embarrass yourself, go ahead. But you get one shot. You miss, you keep your mouth shut and stay behind the med kit where you belong." Sarah lowered herself onto her stomach, feeling the rough stone beneath her, steadying her elbows as she pulled the rifle close. It was heavier than her father's hunting gun but familiar in its mechanics. She adjusted the bipod, pressed her cheek against the stock and looked through the scope. The antenna shimmered in the wavering heat, almost mocking in its distance. She inhaled slowly, her mind shutting out the murmurs behind her, the skepticism heavy in the air. She was not thinking about proving herself to them. She was thinking about her father's voice reminding her, breathe with the earth, not against it. Through the scope she watched the mirage dance, calculated the drift of wind by the dust devils spiraling along the canyon floor. Her hands did not tremble. She adjusted her aim slightly off the antenna, trusting the invisible push of the air to carry her shot true. Around her, the soldiers waited, half amused, half intrigued, but none of them believing the outcome could be anything but failure. She exhaled, slow and steady, and in that breath let go of everything, doubt, fear, even the weight of expectation pressing on her shoulders. Then her finger tightened on the trigger, and the rifle kicked against her shoulder with a sharp crack that echoed across the canyon. For a moment nothing seemed to happen. The sound vanished into the distance, the scope still filled with wavering heat and stone. Then, almost too quickly to believe, a spark flared against the far slope, followed by the metallic clang of the antenna shattering and collapsing sideways into the rocks. The comms mast was gone, toppled by a single shot across an impossible distance. The silence that followed was deeper than before, the kind of silence that carried shock in its stillness. Sarah lifted her head, blinking against the recoil, and looked toward the officer. Hale's mouth was half open, his expression caught between disbelief and grudging respect. The men around him exchanged looks, some grinning in astonishment, others simply staring at her as though seeing her for the first time. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her elbows, her face calm, almost serene, as if she had done nothing more extraordinary than hit a tin can on a fence post. "Like I said," she murmured, handing the rifle back to the corporal. "I can hit it." The canyon still echoed faintly with the metallic crash of the fallen antenna when the SEALs began to stir, their disbelief breaking into fragments of whispers and mutters. Some laughed under their breath, others shook their heads as though trying to clear a trick of the light, but all of them carried the same expression, the raw shock of witnessing something they had declared impossible suddenly made real. Lieutenant Hale kept his eyes locked on Sarah, his pride smarting, his authority punctured by a civilian who had no reason to carry a rifle. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, the words choking on the stubborn refusal to admit he had been wrong. Sarah didn't seek his acknowledgement. She moved calmly back toward the pack where she kept her medical kit, her hands brushing dust from her sleeves. To her it had been a necessary action, not a triumph, though she could feel the weight of their gazes clinging to her as if demanding she explain herself. None of them had expected her to succeed, and now none of them knew how to treat her. A sudden crackle of static broke the stunned silence as one of the team's radios came alive with hurried chatter. The destruction of the enemy's antenna had not gone unnoticed. Somewhere across the ridge, insurgents were scrambling, their communication cut off, their routines disrupted. The SEALs snapped back to discipline, rifles raised, eyes scanning the jagged skyline for signs of movement. Hale barked quick orders, his voice regaining its authority even as the disbelief lingered in his tone. "Eyes sharp. They'll be moving on us fast. Diaz, cover the north slope. Jenkins, watch the canyon floor." The men dispersed into their positions with practiced speed, their laughter gone, their professionalism sealed back in place. Sarah crouched near the gear, alert but calm, ready to drag her kit forward if blood was spilled. She had no illusions about the danger now rushing toward them, and in that danger she knew her shot had bound her to these men whether they accepted it or not. The first enemy figures appeared as shadows darting between rocks, their rifles glinting in the harsh light. Muzzle flashes tore the silence, sending rounds snapping into the stone around the SEALs' position. The team returned fire in measured bursts, their training turning chaos into rhythm. Sarah stayed low, but her eyes never wavered, tracking movements the soldiers missed. She had spent months moving through villages, watching how people shifted, how danger unfolded not in the sound of gunfire but in the twitch of a hand, the flicker of eyes. When one of the insurgents flanked low across the canyon lip, unseen by the others, Sarah's voice cut sharp and steady through the noise. "Left ridge near the split rock." Hale's instinct was to ignore her, but Jenkins pivoted at the call, squeezing off a burst that dropped the figure before he could fire. The soldier glanced back toward her with startled gratitude, but Hale only clenched his jaw tighter, unwilling to acknowledge her presence shaping the fight. Minutes stretched like hours as the firefight surged and broke against the canyon walls. Dust rose in choking clouds, bullets sparking stone into shards, shouts and commands echoing against the roar of rifles. Through it all Sarah moved with purpose, dragging her kit to whoever needed her hands. She pressed bandages against Diaz's arm when a shard of rock tore his flesh, sealed a wound on another man's thigh with strips of gauze, and returned again to the edge to spot movements none of them caught in the haze. She did not fire another shot, but her presence was felt in every shift of the battle, as though the impossible precision she had shown had carried over into her eyes, her awareness, her calm. By the time the last enemy fell back into the rocks and silence settled over the canyon once more, the SEALs found themselves alive with fewer wounds than they might have expected. Their breaths came heavy, their nerves buzzing, but their line had held. As they regrouped, Hale scanned his men, his expression hard, searching for weakness, for excuses to explain what had unfolded. But all eyes kept flicking toward Sarah, not with the skepticism of earlier but with something closer to respect, even awe. She stood apart from them, her hands still streaked with dust and blood, her scarf pulled loose around her shoulders, her gaze distant across the canyon as if still tracking the fallen antenna. Hale's pride warred with his reason, yet even he could not deny what had been seen. He stepped closer, his shadow cutting across the ground at her feet. "You got lucky," he said finally, his tone sharp but less certain than before. "One shot doesn't make you part of this team." "Don't think it does." Sarah lifted her head slowly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I'm not trying to be part of your team," she replied evenly. "I'm trying to keep you alive." The words cut deeper than he expected, not in defiance but in their plain truth. Around them, the men exchanged glances, sensing the unspoken shift that Hale refused to voice. The battle had proved something no dismissal could erase. This woman, civilian though she was, had altered the course of their mission with a single act. Hale turned away, barking orders to pack up and move before reinforcements could arrive, but his steps carried a stiffness that betrayed his inner turmoil. The unit moved out along the ridge, their boots crunching against stone, their eyes sharper than before, and for the first time Sarah walked not behind them as a bystander but among them, her presence a quiet reminder that sometimes the line between soldier and civilian blurred in ways no one could predict. The sun was sinking lower, staining the jagged peaks in shades of gold and crimson as the SEAL unit pressed forward along a narrow trail cut into the mountainside. The firefight had left them weary, but their mission demanded momentum, and Hale was determined not to let the enemy regain the initiative. Sarah walked with them, her pack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, her eyes scanning the terrain with the same patience she had shown before. The soldiers had stopped trying to send her to the rear. After her warning during the battle and the impossible shot that crippled enemy comms, she had earned a place in the column, whether Hale admitted it or not. Some of the men even drifted closer to her, striking up quiet exchanges between scanning ridgelines. Jenkins asked where she had learned to shoot like that, his voice hushed as though afraid Hale might hear. Sarah answered simply, telling him about her father's lessons on the farm, about the hours spent sighting tin cans against shifting winds. She spoke without pride, without exaggeration, and in her simplicity the men found something grounding. Night fell quickly in the mountains, the sharp chill replacing the heat of day, and the team settled into a temporary hide among jagged rocks. They kept their movements minimal, their lights dimmed, every sound muffled under the weight of enemy territory. Sarah tended to Diaz's arm again, changing the bandages by the faint glow of a red-filtered lamp. He thanked her quietly, his gratitude genuine, and she nodded as though such service were ordinary. Across the camp, Hale watched her with a guarded eye, his thoughts a tangle he would not share. He could not dismiss what she had done, but he clung to the discipline drilled into him. That a civilian had no place in the field, that an outsider weakened cohesion, that unpredictability was a liability. Yet as he studied his men, he saw their shoulders less tense when she moved among them, their morale steadier, their glances toward her carrying a silent reassurance. It was not just her skills, it was the calm she projected, the way she made danger feel survivable. Hale looked away, unwilling to acknowledge the truth settling in his chest. The mission demanded they advance toward a network of caves where enemy fighters were believed to be stockpiling weapons. Intelligence suggested the caves were guarded by sentries, hidden and disciplined, the kind that could turn an approach into a massacre if not handled with care. Before dawn, the SEALs prepared to move, their gear checked and rechecked, their weapons cleaned in silence. Sarah packed her kit without question, refusing to be left behind. Hale nearly ordered her to stay, but he bit back the command, aware it would only breed friction among his men now leaning toward her presence. He told himself she would keep quiet, that she would follow directions, that her usefulness had limits. But as they moved down into the canyons, she once again proved him wrong. It began with a faint scrape of stone, a sound the SEALs dismissed as natural in the restless wind. Sarah froze instantly, her head tilting, her eyes narrowing toward the ridge above them. She whispered sharply, 2 o'clock high ground. Jenkins raised his rifle at the direction she indicated, and through his scope spotted a figure crouched low with binoculars. A sentry concealed so well none of them had noticed. Without hesitation Jenkins fired, dropping the man before he could signal. The team went still, glancing at Sarah with fresh astonishment. Hale's lips tightened, his pride burning, but he could not ignore the fact that she had once again saved them from walking into danger blind. As the caves drew closer, the terrain grew treacherous, jagged rocks jutting like broken teeth from the canyon floor. The SEALs slowed, their nerves stretched taut as they scanned for hidden threats. Sarah remained in the center of the formation, her hands steady on her pack straps, her eyes roving with unhurried focus. When the faint glint of metal caught her attention near the cave mouth, she stopped abruptly. "Tripwire," she murmured, pointing toward the shadowed entrance. The men gathered closer and sure enough, the thin line stretched barely visible across the rock, leading to a cluster of mines buried shallow. A trap meant to shred the first team foolish enough to rush in. The SEALs worked swiftly to disarm it, muttering under their breath about how close they had come to disaster. Hale said nothing, but the look he shot Sarah carried no dismissal this time, only acknowledgement wrapped in frustration. The cave network loomed before them, dark and silent, its depth unknown. They knew the fight ahead would be brutal, close quarters, the kind that left little room for error. Sarah tightened her scarf, her expression unreadable as she studied the entrance. She was no soldier, yet every step deeper into this mission had tethered her to the team's fate. She understood now that survival was no longer just theirs or hers. It was shared, bound by the impossible shot that had changed everything. As the SEALs slipped inside, their shadows swallowed by the cave's mouth, Sarah followed without hesitation, her resolve as steady as her breath, prepared to prove again that what others dismissed as impossible could be the difference between defeat and survival. The air inside the cave was thick and damp, carrying the faint stench of oil and sweat, the unmistakable signs of occupation. The SEALs moved in disciplined silence, night vision goggles painting the tunnel ahead in ghostly green. Their boots pressed lightly against the stone, every step deliberate, rifles raised and ready. Sarah stayed near the rear, close enough to respond if one of them went down but careful not to break formation. The darkness pressed heavy, muffling even the sound of their breath, until the faint drip of water echoed like a heartbeat through the cavern. The deeper they went, the narrower the walls became, the light from the entrance fading behind them until only shadows and the thin hum of tension remained. Every man felt the weight of imminent violence, and Sarah felt it too, though she carried no weapon now. What she had was instinct, sharpened not by combat training but by a lifetime of quiet observation, and that instinct would not let her ignore the shift in the air ahead. She halted suddenly, her hand rising in an unconscious signal that mirrored the SEAL's own gestures. They glanced back, surprised that a civilian would dare to interrupt the flow, but Sarah's eyes were fixed on the uneven wall to their left. The stone looked natural enough, but the faint scrape she had heard moments before still rang in her ears. She whispered, barely audible, "Someone's there." Hale clenched his jaw, about to dismiss her, but Diaz raised his hand, listening hard. A breath of movement stirred, so faint it could have been imagined, until a figure lunged from the shadows, weapon raised. The SEALs fired instantly, dropping him before he could squeeze the trigger, the echoes booming through the cave like thunder. The team froze, bracing for the response, but none came. It had been a lone guard, hidden in an alcove no one else had spotted. Hale stared at the body, then back at Sarah, and though his pride resisted, he nodded once, the briefest acknowledgement that she had saved them again. They pressed deeper, the tunnel splitting into multiple branches. Hale signaled silently, dividing his men to cover each path, but he kept Sarah close to his group, perhaps unwilling to admit he wanted her watchful eyes where he could see them. The walls widened into a chamber, its floor scattered with crates marked in a language none of them recognized but which all knew to mean weapons. Diaz crouched to pry one open, revealing rifles stacked neatly inside, their barrels gleaming even in the dim light. It was confirmation of their intelligence, and with it the weight of knowing they had stepped into the heart of something far larger than expected. Hale moved swiftly, placing charges to destroy the stockpile, his hands sure despite the gnaw of unease in his gut. The longer they lingered, the greater the risk of discovery, but the tunnels pressed outward, promising more hidden caches, perhaps even command nodes. He made the decision to push further, and though his men followed without question, he caught Sarah's glance, calm but knowing, as if she sensed the storm about to break. The first burst of enemy gunfire came like a spark in dry tinder, erupting from a side passage as a squad of insurgents stormed into the chamber. The SEALs dropped to cover, returning fire in disciplined bursts that lit the walls with flickering green flashes. Sarah hit the ground behind a crate, pulling her kit close as stone splinters rained around her. A scream tore through the noise as one of the SEALs went down, a bullet ripping through his side. Without hesitation, Sarah crawled across the ground, dragging herself to his body under a hail of gunfire. She pressed her hands to the wound, her voice steady even as chaos roared around her. "Stay with me, you're not done," she murmured, pulling gauze and sealing the bleeding with movements quick and sure. Her calmness was a strange anchor in the storm, keeping the wounded man conscious as Hale and the others fought to hold the line. The firefight raged, but slowly the SEALs' discipline forced the insurgents back. Hale advanced with ruthless precision, his rifle barking sharp commands with every squeeze of the trigger. When the last echo faded and the tunnel fell silent again, 3 enemy bodies lay still, their rifles clattering across the stone. The SEALs regrouped, breathing hard, checking ammo and wounds. Sarah stayed with the injured man, finishing the dressing, her hands steady though her arms ached with strain. Hale looked at her then, not with mockery, not with dismissal, but with something closer to respect. She had not hesitated, had not panicked, and in that moment she had been as vital as any soldier in his command. But there was no time to rest. The echoes of gunfire would carry and more enemies would come. Hale gave the order to move, his voice clipped but steady, and the team slipped deeper into the cave system, their senses sharpened, their nerves taut. Sarah followed without question, her face set, her steps sure. She knew now that she had crossed an unseen line. She was no longer just the medic, no longer just the woman who had made the impossible shot. She was part of their survival, bound to them by blood and fire, her presence woven into the fabric of their mission whether Hale accepted it or not. And though the darkness ahead promised only greater danger, Sarah felt no hesitation. She had already proved herself once, and she knew she would again, not because she sought recognition but because the lives around her depended on it. The tunnels twisted like the veins of some buried beast, every bend a promise of danger, every shadow a potential ambush. The SEALs moved swiftly but cautiously, their boots whispering against stone, rifles raised and steady. Sarah followed close behind, her pack heavier now with bloodied gauze and empty bandages, but her pace did not falter. The injured man she had patched clung to the shoulders of 2 teammates, able to move but weakened, and she stayed near him, ready to intervene again if the bleeding worsened. The cave seemed endless, the air dense with the mingled scents of dust, oil and gunpowder, each step pulling them deeper into hostile ground. The silence pressed heavily until it broke with the faint scuff of movement ahead, too deliberate to be natural. Hale froze, raising a fist, and the column dropped instantly to cover. He scanned the shadows, his jaw tightening. They were not alone. From the darkness erupted the staccato roar of automatic rifles, the cave flaring with muzzle flashes as bullets ricocheted from stone. The SEALs answered with disciplined fire, their shots measured, their movements practiced, but the volume of enemies pouring from hidden alcoves was greater than expected. Shadows darted across the walls, shouts echoed in foreign tongues and grenades clattered against rock, forcing the team to dive behind scattered crates in natural cover. The chamber had become a trap, carefully laid, and now it threatened to consume them. Sarah ducked low, her heart hammering, her hands gripping the straps of her kit. She saw one of the SEALs pinned behind a boulder, unable to fire without drawing lethal return shots, and she saw Diaz struggling to reload with his wounded arm shaking. She did not think, she moved. Crawling on hands and knees, she dragged a fresh magazine from the fallen enemy's pouch and slid it across the stone to Diaz, her voice sharp and steady. "Here, take it." He caught it with a nod of gratitude, snapping it into place and firing again with renewed strength. The battle surged with brutal intensity, stones splintering under the onslaught, the confined space amplifying every sound into deafening chaos. Sarah kept low, moving from man to man, pressing tourniquets where needed, shouting warnings when she spotted shadows shifting above. At one point she yanked Jenkins backward just as a burst of fire stitched the ground where he had crouched seconds earlier. He looked at her with wide eyes, realizing she had saved his life, then pushed back into the fight with a grim nod. Hale caught glimpses of her in the storm, her figure weaving between his men, her voice carrying calm directions, her hands steady even as bullets tore the air. It defied his training, defied his expectations, but it was undeniable. She was keeping his unit alive. Then came the moment that changed everything. From a higher ledge carved into the chamber wall, an enemy fighter swung a heavy machine gun into position, its barrel glowing faintly in the dark. The angle gave him clear command over the chamber, and when the first burst sprayed downward, stone exploded into shards, forcing the SEALs flat against the ground. They were pinned, their rifles useless against the suppressing fire raining down. Hale cursed under his breath, scanning desperately for a solution, but the machine gunner had locked the chamber, and every second wasted meant another man would be torn apart. And then, through the chaos, Sarah's eyes locked on the figure above. She saw the way the gun wavered slightly between bursts, the pause when he reloaded, the brief window in which a well-placed shot could end the slaughter. She reached instinctively for the rifle slung across the back of one of the fallen insurgents, pulling it free and snapping to her stomach behind a crate. Hale saw her movements, his heart jolting with disbelief. "No, don't you dare," he shouted, but his voice was drowned by the thunder of the gun. Sarah braced the weapon against her shoulder, her breath slowing, her mind narrowing to the single thread of focus she had carried since childhood. She remembered the tin cans, the wind across the plains, her father's voice in her ear. She tracked the machine gunner's rhythm, waited for the exact moment when his reload left him exposed, and then squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked, the shot cracked sharp against the cavern walls, and the figure above jerked violently before crumpling sideways. The machine gun toppled with him, crashing to the stone below. For a heartbeat the chamber went still, and then the SEALs surged back into action, their fire coordinated, relentless, cutting down the remaining fighters with surgical precision. When the echoes faded, the silence was thick with disbelief. The machine gun lay twisted on the ground, its thread erased by a single precise shot. Sarah lowered the rifle slowly, her breathing calm, her expression unshaken. Around her, the SEALs exchanged looks of astonishment and respect, their earlier doubts burned away in the fire of survival. Hale stood rigid, his eyes fixed on her, his chest heaving with the remnants of adrenaline. He wanted to scold her for disobeying, for breaking rules, for stepping beyond her place. But the words caught in his throat, strangled by the undeniable truth: she had saved them all. Without her, they would have been buried in that chamber, cut down where they stood. He exhaled slowly, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "We move," he ordered, the words carrying no rebuke this time, only the weight of command tempered by reluctant respect. The team gathered themselves, checking wounds, reloading, steadying their nerves. Sarah returned the rifle to the ground without a word, picking up her medical kit again as though nothing had changed. But everything had. The way the men glanced at her now carried no skepticism, no mockery, only the quiet reverence reserved for those who had proven themselves in fire. As they pressed deeper into the tunnels, the mission unfinished and danger still looming, Sarah walked among them not as an outsider but as one of their own, her presence silent proof that sometimes the strength that saves a unit comes from the most unexpected place. The tunnels narrowed again after the battle, the floor slick with dust and the acrid tang of gunpowder lingering heavy in the air. The SEALs pressed on with grim determination, their bodies tense, their movements sharp, every sense tuned to the possibility of another ambush. They had taken losses, but the unit still moved with precision, their discipline unbroken, their trust in one another reinforced by survival. Sarah stayed close, her kit streaked with blood, her scarf damp with sweat, her eyes unblinking as she scanned the darkness. Her shot had saved them from annihilation, and though no one spoke it aloud, the men had begun to move with an unconscious adjustment that placed her within their protective arc, not as a liability but as an essential part of their formation. Hale noticed it, his pride grinding against the truth, but he did not correct them. He could not. Not after what she had done. The deeper they went, the more signs of enemy presence appeared. Discarded ration tins, boot prints in the dust, the faint smell of smoke drifting from deeper chambers, all proof that the caves housed more than just weapons. Intelligence had hinted at a command post hidden within these mountains, and now the evidence pressed closer to confirmation. Hale signaled the team to slow, their rifles shifting silently, their eyes sharp behind night vision lenses. Sarah crouched low with them, her breathing steady, her heartbeat controlled, though the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily against her ribs. She knew this would be the heart of the mission, the point where failure meant not just retreat but obliteration. They reached a chamber larger than the others, its ceiling rising into jagged shadows, its floor littered with crates, maps pinned to rock walls and radio equipment humming faintly. Figures moved in the gloom, insurgent leaders, armed guards, their voices low and urgent. It was the command center, exactly as suspected, and now the SEALs faced the impossible task of seizing it without being torn apart by the dozens of rifles already in position. Hale crouched behind a pillar of stone, his mind racing, the odds grim. A frontal assault meant certain slaughter, but retreat would hand victory back to the enemy. His men looked to him for direction, but before he could speak, Sarah's hand touched his arm lightly, her eyes fixed on the ceiling above. There, barely visible in the dim light, was a series of jagged outcroppings leading toward a narrow ledge above the chamber. From that vantage, a shooter could cover the entire room, targeting commanders and heavy gunners, turning chaos into opportunity. Hale followed her gaze, his instincts warring with his reason. It was madness to send someone climbing in the dark under enemy noses, yet he knew instantly what she was thinking. His mouth tightened. "Out of the question," he whispered. "That's a death sentence." But Sarah shook her head, her voice calm, her resolve unshakable. "You need an angle. They won't see me. Let me do it." The audacity of her words sent a ripple through the men nearby. Jenkins started to protest, but his voice caught when he saw her expression. Steady, unflinching, as though she had already accepted the risk. Hale wanted to refuse, to lock her in place, but his tactical mind betrayed him. She was right. From above, even one precise shooter could unravel the enemy's advantage, and none of his men could attempt the climb without giving themselves away. Sarah had the balance, the patience, the quiet way of moving that had already saved them twice. He exhaled hard, the decision burning his pride, but survival demanded it. He pressed his hand briefly to her shoulder, his voice low. "One chance. You take it, you don't miss. Or we all die here." She nodded once, no bravado, no smile, just the calm certainty that had carried her this far. She slipped into the shadows, her hands gripping the rough stone as she climbed, her movements fluid and silent. Every step upward carried the risk of discovery, but the enemy voices below masked the faint scrape of her boots, the soft breath against the rock. She reached the ledge, pressed herself flat, and slowly eased the captured rifle into position. Through the scope, she saw the enemy commander hunched over a radio set, barking orders into the static. Around him, guards paced with weapons ready, their positions strong but predictable. Sarah steadied her breathing, letting the rhythm of her body sync with the earth, the way her father had taught her long ago. She chose her target carefully, adjusted for the faint drift of air through the cavern, and squeezed the trigger. The first shot struck true, the commander collapsing against the radio in a spray of sparks and blood. Before the others could react, she shifted, firing again, cutting down the heavy gunner, turning his weapon toward the SEAL's hiding place. Chaos erupted instantly, shouts echoing, insurgents scattering, their formation crumbling under the sudden precision death from above. Hale roared the order, and his men surged forward, rifles blazing, cutting into the disorganized fighters. The chamber became a storm of gunfire, but the advantage was theirs now, their movements sharp and coordinated, every enemy cut down in a tide of disciplined violence. From her perch, Sarah picked off threats with uncanny accuracy, her calm focus turning the impossible into inevitability. When the smoke cleared, the chamber lay silent, broken only by the crackle of damaged radios and the groans of wounded enemies. The SEALs moved swiftly, securing the area, gathering intelligence from maps and files. Hale looked up at the ledge, his eyes locking on Sarah as she lowered the rifle, her face pale with exhaustion but her expression steady. He felt a weight lift from his chest, the grudging acknowledgement transforming into something deeper, respect, absolute and unshakable. She had not only saved them again, she had turned the tide of the entire mission. Without her, they would have been slaughtered in the dark. With her, they had struck at the very heart of the enemy. As she climbed down to rejoin them, the men moved aside, parting without command, their gazes filled with admiration. No words were spoken, but the silence carried more than applause ever could. Sarah adjusted her scarf, lifted her kit, and stood among them once more, her presence no longer questioned, no longer doubted. She was one of them now, not by training, not by rank, but by fire, by blood, by the simple truth of survival. The chamber still echoed faintly with the last bursts of gunfire when Hale gave the order to move. The mission had achieved its core objective. The enemy's command center was destroyed, their leaders scattered or dead, their stockpiles compromised. But the cave network was far from secure, and every second spent lingering invited reinforcements to swarm the tunnels and trap them inside. The SEALs worked quickly, sweeping the room for documents, maps and hard drives, stuffing what intelligence they could carry into their packs. Sarah stood among them, her rifle resting lightly against her shoulder, her eyes scanning the shadows with unrelenting vigilance. She had not grown careless after the victory. She knew that silence in enemy territory was always temporary, and she felt the weight of pursuit pressing closer with every breath. The team moved back into the narrow tunnels, retracing their path toward the surface. Their boots crunched softly, their rifles raised, every man sharp with the tension of withdrawal. Extraction was always the hardest phase, Hale knew, the enemy desperate, the soldiers weary, the terrain stacked against them. He glanced at Sarah more than once, not with skepticism anymore but with an awareness he could not ignore. She had been the difference between life and death too many times already, and he no longer tried to deny it. Her face was calm in the green glow of night vision, her movements precise, her senses as sharp as his best men. She did not belong to his chain of command but she belonged to this mission now. They were halfway back when the trap was sprung. A distant explosion rocked the tunnel, collapsing part of the passage behind them and cutting off retreat. Dust filled the air in choking clouds, and before it settled, the first wave of enemy fighters surged forward from a side passage, their shouts echoing, their weapons blazing. The SEALs dropped instantly into defensive positions, returning fire in tight bursts, but the confined space turned the firefight into chaos. Bullets sparked against stone, grenades thudded against walls, fragments slicing the air. Sarah ducked low beside Diaz, pulling her kit close, her hands already reaching for gauze and clamps as another man went down with a torn shoulder. She worked fast, her movements automatic, her voice steady even as rifle fire roared inches above her head. The fight pressed closer, the insurgents determined to overwhelm by sheer numbers. Hale barked orders, shifting his men into choke points, forcing the enemy to funnel into narrow lines of fire. But he could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of numbers threatening to crush them. They were outnumbered 3-1, their ammunition thinning, their escape blocked. Sarah glanced toward the collapsed tunnel, her mind racing. She spotted a ventilation shaft running upward through the rock, narrow but climbable, leading toward faint glimmers of starlight. She tugged at Hale's sleeve, shouting over the noise, "Up there! A way out!" He followed her gaze, cursing under his breath. It was a desperate path, dangerous and exposed, but it was the only option. Cover fire. Hale roared, and his men redoubled their shots, filling the tunnel with suppressive fire. Sarah slung her kit and scrambled toward the shaft, her boots finding purchase on jagged stone. She climbed quickly, pulling herself upward with surprising strength, the starlight growing brighter above. When she reached the lip, she hauled herself onto the surface and looked back down. The shaft was tight, forcing one man at a time, but it was possible. She waved them upward urgently, her voice carrying through the dust. "Come on. Move." One by one the SEALs began to climb, handing weapons up, dragging each other through the narrow opening. Sarah helped them over the edge, pulling with all the strength her wiry frame carried, her palms raw against the stone. But the enemy pressed harder below, their shouts closer, their gunfire rattling the rock. Hale was last, holding the rear as his men escaped, his rifle barking in short bursts. Sarah leaned over, extending her arm. "Now!" she shouted, her voice fierce. He fired one last burst, then slung his rifle and leapt upward, her hand gripping his wrist as she pulled him through with every ounce of strength she had. They collapsed onto the surface together, the cold night air rushing over them, the stars burning bright above the jagged peaks. For a moment they simply lay there, the silence broken only by the pounding of their hearts, the distant echoes of enemy voices muffled below. But the danger was not over. As the team regrouped on the ridge, a fresh wave of insurgents appeared across the slope, moving fast, determined to finish what the caves had failed to accomplish. The SEALs formed a defensive line, their rifles flaring in the night, but their ammunition was dangerously low, and the enemy came in greater numbers than before. Sarah crouched behind a boulder, her eyes scanning, her mind racing for an advantage. She spotted a line of fuel barrels stacked against a supply hut at the far end of the slope, faint glints catching in the moonlight. She raised her voice, sharp and certain. "The barrels? Take them out." Jenkins caught her meaning instantly, aiming high. His round struck true, and the barrels erupted in a towering explosion, fire racing across the slope, cutting the enemy line in half. The blast bought them precious seconds, enough to break contact and sprint toward the extraction zone. Their lungs burned, their muscles screamed, but they pushed through the darkness, the sound of pursuit chasing them across the rocks. Sarah ran with them, her pack bouncing against her back, her breath even, her stride steady. She did not falter, did not stumble, did not let the exhaustion break her. She knew the fight was not finished, but she also knew they were close now, close to survival. And though Hale had not spoken, the look he gave her as they ran carried everything unspoken. Acknowledgement, gratitude, and the unyielding truth that without her, none of them would still be alive. The night air was sharp and cold, biting against sweat-soaked skin as the team pushed hard across the ridge toward the extraction zone. Their boots struck loose stone, sending pebbles skittering down the slope, their lungs burning as the altitude punished every breath. Behind them, angry shouts carried through the dark, the enemy refusing to let go, chasing like wolves desperate for a kill. The SEALs kept their formation tight, rifles raised, their movements precise even under exhaustion. Sarah ran with them, her kit thumping against her back, her rifle gripped firmly in her hands. She was not trained for this, not molded by years of drills or conditioning, but her pace never faltered. Every step was powered by something deeper, an unshakable refusal to see these men die when survival was within reach. The glow of the extraction zone's beacon finally flickered in the distance, a faint green light against the jagged rocks, and it drove them harder. Hale raised his fist, signaling silence, and the team slowed, lowering themselves into cover along a rocky outcrop. The helicopter would not land while hostiles were this close. They needed to hold until it arrived. Ammunition was almost gone, bodies bruised and battered, but there was no choice left. They formed a defensive circle, rifles covering every approach, their eyes fixed on the shifting shadows below where enemy fighters massed for one final assault. Sarah crouched beside Diaz, her hands trembling only slightly as she checked the last of her medical supplies. She had maybe 2 tourniquets, half a roll of gauze and morphine left. It wasn't much, but she would make it stretch if more men went down. The first wave came fast, figures charging up the slope with wild shouts, their rifles flashing. The SEALs answered with controlled bursts, each shot placed with deadly precision, dropping attackers one by one. Sarah pressed her back against the stone, firing in short, careful bursts when the line pressed too close, then dropping her rifle to drag Jenkins back when a round clipped his leg. She worked swiftly, her hands steady even as bullets tore chunks of rock above her head, binding his wound, pushing him back into the fight. Hale saw her, and something in his chest tightened, a recognition that went beyond gratitude. This woman, untrained and uninvited, was standing shoulder to shoulder with his best men and never once flinching. The fight dragged on relentless. Every time the enemy seemed broken, more surged from the shadows, climbing the slope like ants swarming a hill. The SEALs' fire grew thinner, magazines clattering empty to the ground, sidearms replacing rifles as their last rounds were spent. The enemy crept closer, their shouts louder, their shadows stretching long against the flames still burning on the lower slope. And then, over the chaos, came the deep thump-thump-thump of rotor blades cutting the night air. The helicopter swept over the ridge, its searchlight piercing the dark, its mounted gun spitting fire down the slope to carve gaps into the enemy lines. The men cheered hoarsely, relief flooding through them, but extraction was still a gauntlet. The bird could not hover long under fire. They had seconds to move. Go. Move. Hale bellowed, his voice raw with urgency. The team surged toward the clearing, dragging Jenkins between them, weapons raised for cover. Sarah ran beside them, firing when she had to, her breath sharp in her chest. The helicopter skids touched down briefly, the door gunner shouting for them to hurry. The SEALs piled in fast, hauling their wounded, slamming against the metal floor. Sarah reached the edge, her boots slipping on loose stone, and Hale's hand shot out, gripping her arm and yanking her aboard with a force that nearly dislocated her shoulder. The bird lifted instantly, bullets sparking against its hull as it clawed into the sky, banking hard over the burning ridges below. The enemy's shouts faded into the distance, swallowed by the thundering rotors. They were safe, finally irreversibly safe. Inside the helicopter, the cabin was chaos. Men bleeding, panting, slumping against the walls, their faces smeared with dirt and exhaustion. But they were alive, every one of them, and that alone was a miracle. Sarah sat against the bulkhead, her chest heaving, her hands shaking only now that the adrenaline ebbed away. She looked at the men she had saved, Jenkins clutching his leg, Diaz with his arm bound tight, Hale watching her with eyes that no longer held doubt. The SEALs, hardened veterans, men who had scoffed at her presence, now nodded toward her with respect so raw it cut deeper than words. They knew as surely as she did, that without her they would have been left in that cave, their mission buried with them. When the helicopter touched down at the forward base, medics rushed in, hauling stretchers, shouting for triage. Sarah moved instinctively, sliding down with them, directing where her makeshift bandages had been placed, explaining who needed urgent care first. The medics gave her quick, bewildered glances, trying to place this woman among the SEALs, but they obeyed her precise instructions without question. When the wounded were finally whisked away and the last supplies unloaded, Hale approached her, his face lined with exhaustion but his voice carrying quiet weight. "You weren't supposed to be there," he said almost to himself. Sarah met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "But I was," she answered simply. For a long moment Hale said nothing. Then, in front of his men, he extended his hand. "You saved my team," he said, his voice low but steady. "That makes you one of us." The gesture was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. Sarah clasped his hand firmly, her grip strong despite her fatigue. Around them, the SEALs nodded in solemn agreement, their respect etched into every look. In their world, trust was earned only in fire, and she had walked through it beside them without faltering. That night, as the base settled into uneasy silence, Sarah sat alone beneath the stars. The desert stretched vast and unbroken, the air cold against her skin, the memory of gunfire still echoing faintly in her mind. She was no soldier, not by training or by uniform, but she had stood where soldiers stood, bled where they bled, and carried her weight among them. The world would never know her name, her shot, her choices in the dark tunnels of that mountain. But the men who had lived because of her would never forget. And that was enough. The end.